Hey guys, tonight we drift back into the flickering candlelight of a place where bureaucracy wasn't just a nuisance, it was a matter of life, death, and ink color. You're standing in a chilly stone chamber that smells of wax-moldy scrolls and the faintest tinge of vinegar. You hear the gentle scratch of quills, hundreds of them dancing in unison like a hive of bees. This is the heart of the Byzantine bureaucracy. And if you're planning to pick up a pen, you better check the color of your ink. Because here's the thing, if you so much as touch the blue ink, the one reserved for emperors and sacred decrees, you're not just being rebellious. You're committing treason. That one ink that regal azure made from ground lapis lazuli and guarded more tightly than the treasury could quite literally cost you your head. And no, you probably wouldn't survive your first week in this job. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and what time it is where you are. I love seeing where in the world you're tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge into the great palace of Constantinople, not as a conqueror or foreign dignitary, but as something far more dangerous, a mid-level bureaucrat. Your sandals tap along marble floors as you approach the imperial chancellery, where empires are filed, not fought. It's easy to assume nothing dramatic ever happens in a room full of paper pushers, but this is Byzantium. Even the ink is political. Blue. The moment your eyes land on it, you feel your breath catch. The imperial scribes sit on elevated wooden platforms, their hands gliding smoothly across parchment with practiced ease. Each stroke of blue ink glows faintly in the light, as if it knows it is above you. It's not just a color, it's a symbol, a weapon, an identity. Historians still argue whether the exclusivity of blue ink was strictly enforced at all levels or just ceremonially guarded. Some claim palace guards monitored its use like hawks. Others suggest enforcement varied depending on who was watching. But the law, in its cold, unbending nature, was clear. Only the emperor and select few proxies could issue documents in blue. Everyone else stick to black-brown, or if you're feeling fancy, red. And yes, color mattered, not just for vanity or clarity. In a world where most people were illiterate, ink hue conveyed the seriousness, origin, and even intent of a document. A blue signature meant the emperor had touched it, or at least someone with permission to pretend he did. Red might mean a matter of military concern. Black, boring but essential. Brown, budget meeting. Probably one you're already late to. One sleepy scribe next to you dips his pen into a dull walnut ink, sighing audibly. Another land dispute from Bithynia, he mutters. The olives again. You don't ask, you just nod. Because if there's anything Byzantine bureaucrats excel at, it's turning a perfectly ordinary olive grove into a 400-page epic, complete with 5 ink colors and 3 contradictory rulings. Even in a room filled with the rustling of papyrus and the creak of wood, there's a strange reverence. The blue ink table is cordoned off by a low golden chain. 2 scribes hover near it, like temple priests guarding a relic. They wear gloves. They look tired. There's a whisper among the younger clerks that one assistant once spilled the blue ink and spent a week cleaning stables in Cappadocia. Another version claims he vanished entirely reassigned to peripheral duties in the snake-riddled ruins of Nicopolis. Neither version ends well. Both end with him never touching blue again. In modern times, we might laugh. A whole empire getting twitchy over ink. But when symbols rule perception, and perception fuels power, even pigment, becomes a matter of state. What made blue so special? It was expensive, back-breaking to extract. True ultramarine came from lapis lazuli, mined in what's now Afghanistan. Getting it to Constantinople took camel caravans, sea routes, and a string of merchants who each took a generous cut. It was rarer than gold, and in many ways more valuable because it signed declarations, not just decorated crowns. Quirkily enough, it also made for terrible ink if handled improperly. Too gritty, too opaque. The scribes had to blend it just right with honey vinegar and sometimes egg white to make it smooth enough to write, but vibrant enough to stand out. Some even whispered that a trace of holy oil helped stabilize the pigment. Historians still debate whether this was actual practice or just monkish superstition. The very act of preparing the ink became a ritual. Only senior scribes, called chartularios, were allowed to handle the blue. Some had the ink blessed. Others swore over it. One allegedly bowed to it every morning before work, though that might have been a side effect of too much myrrh incense. What's certain is this: the moment blue touched parchment, it changed everything. A simple message about road repair. With blue ink, it became law. An offhand note from the emperor's cousin. With blue ink, it became sacred directive. The ink transformed paper into proclamation. The funny part, most of the emperor's messages were still dictated. He rarely picked up the pen himself. But the ink that did the heavy lifting. As the day wears on and the scriptorium glows warm with golden candlelight, you finally make your way to your station. It's less grand than the blue table, but you do have your own supply of brown-black ink made from oak galls and wine sediment. It smells faintly of vinegar and cloves. It's not glorious, but it gets the job done. You dip your pen. You scratch out a name. You sign date initial, and then pause. Just for a second, you glance over your shoulder toward the glimmering bowl of blue. It sits there, quietly glowing under its lantern like a sleeping dragon. Tempting, dangerous, powerful. You look away. You still like your job. You shuffle your sandals across the polished marble floor of the imperial chancery, your breath just barely audible above the rhythmic scratching of quills. Dozens of men are hunched over desks in orderly rows, each swathed in stiff, color-coded silk robes that rustle faintly with each movement. Not because they're trying to look impressive, though they often are, but because in the Byzantine world, even your outfit dictated your status, and often your sanity. The red-trimmed ones manage correspondence. The green-trimmed ones, tax calculations mostly incomprehensible even to them. And the pale lavender crew near the end, they just sort alphabetically. Poor souls. This is the Byzantine bureaucracy. It doesn't exactly thrum with excitement. It hums softly like a sleepy beehive that runs the known world by sheer force of monotony. You, a junior clerk, are handed a stack of petitions bound with twine dyed a shade of blue so specific it has its own name, cyanocloron. The clerk who gives it to you doesn't say a word, just gives a slow, knowing nod. That means it's serious, or it's nothing. With Byzantine forms, it's often hard to tell. Everyone here is obsessed with two things, protocol and ink, and not necessarily in that order. Most of these men spent decades mastering the proper phrasing for addressing a mid-tier palace eunuch, or the correct margin spacing for imperial edicts. Their careers hinge on knowing whether to write in black-red, or heaven help you, purple ink. Purple is for the emperor. That's not just a tradition, It's a borderline sacred act. Use it without permission, and you don't just get fired, you vanish. Gently, but permanently. Somewhere deep within this bureaucratic hive, a man called the Chartularios watches you from behind a curtain. He's in charge of record integrity. His robe is lined in midnight blue like a dark sea just before dawn. That means he has access to what's called authorized imperial pigment. He hasn't used it in 5 years. He's waiting for just the right document, or rumor has it, for retirement. Historians still argue whether these color codes were strictly enforced across the whole empire, or just in Constantinople. Some suggest rural outposts couldn't even tell the difference between oxblood red and imperial vermilion. Others think color was less about hierarchy and more about clarity. Imagine a world before highlighters when your only way to say urgent was to switch from carbon black to rust red. Either way, the obsession was real, and it wasn't limited to inks. Even wax seals followed the code. Blue wax internal use only. Green religious approval. Gold. Yeah, don't even think about it. What's striking is how much of this ink protocol revolved around fear. Not fear of miscommunication, fear of implication. A poorly chosen ink could suggest forgery defiance or, heaven forbid, ambition. And ambition in the Byzantine world was best left unexpressed in color. Some bureaucrats even hired pigment testers to double-check batches, especially after one scribe died after using tainted cinnabar. Turns out mercury and job security don't mix. But it wasn't all pressure and poisonous red ink. There were small perks. Once a week, the clerks got candied figs and diluted wine, usually right before a visit from a senior functionary. These visits were opportunities to showcase not your charisma, but your handwriting. Flourishes were frowned upon, unless you were drafting imperial correspondence, in which case a mild curlicue on the kappa might earn you a nod. No smile, just a nod. That's what passes for wild enthusiasm in this place. And then there's the scent. Every desk smells faintly of smoke and vinegar from the ink pots. Some say it's soothing. Others say it's the real reason no one ever shouts in the chancery. You're too lightheaded to raise your voice. As you scribble a date in the top right corner of your parchment, you glance at your neighbor's ink. It's oddly green. Not the allowed green, either. You raise an eyebrow. He shrugs. It dried funny, he whispers, eyes darting. That's all he says. You nod. That's all you do. This is not a place for confrontation. It's a place for quiet conformity and very vivid colors. Still, the system works more or less. Petitions are copied. Summaries are drafted. Imperial decisions are made with the help of 100 nervous pen strokes and the occasional imperial sneeze in the next room. The scribes keep the empire running not by muscle or steel, but by ink and a fanatical dedication to which shade of brown means pending. One scholar once joked that if the entire Byzantine administration had been handed modern pens, the empire might have collapsed from overstimulation. Too many colors, too many choices. But maybe, just maybe, that's what made it last for over 1,000 years. The sheer repetitive comfort of knowing that black ink meant the same thing in 1054 as it did in 934. And so you continue dipping your reed pen back into the heavy inkwell with a sigh. Outside, the world argues over thrones and theology. But in here, it's all about pigment ratios and not smudging the margins. You're in the middle of a long, drafty corridor lined with low-slung oil lamps and scroll cubbies, each one tagged with the neatest, tiniest lettering you've ever seen. The walls are the color of old bread, brittle, dry, and oddly warm. Your feet echo softly as you approach a clerk hunched at a desk, furiously dipping his reed pen into a half-dried inkwell. He doesn't look up. He doesn't need to. This isn't his first scroll of the day, more like his 47th. You're watching something both deeply boring and oddly miraculous. A tax document being copied, sealed, and archived in triplicate, all in a whirlwind of colored ink that would make a modern art student blink twice. Every stroke matters. Black ink for general notes, red ink for numbers, green for revisions, and the rare blue ink. Oh, that's for imperial eyes only. No pressure. This scroll, it's a routine property levy for a farmer named Theodoros in Cappadocia. His mule died. His productivity dipped. He begged a reassessment. The request had to pass through no fewer than 6 officials, each adding their verdict, their seal. And here's the fun part. Their ink color. One official used a watered ochre. Another added crimson. By the time it reached the capital, it looked more like a rainbow than a legal document. But this wasn't decoration. Ink colors were how you signaled tone, urgency, and rank without saying a word. A black ink entry might say, noted. A red ink addition might add urgent. But if someone dared touch a scroll with blue ink, especially without permission, that was basically inviting a career-ending conversation with the emperor's chamberlain. You follow the scroll's journey into the great registry hall. The air smells like dust and beeswax. A bored-looking archivist slides the rolled parchment into a cubbyhole labeled Seasonal Tax Relief Petitions, Non-Favorable, Autumn. He doesn't even flinch. It's a Tuesday. Historians still argue whether this rainbow inking tradition started as a means of organization or intimidation. Maybe it was both. Maybe color was a way to make a simple message shout from the parchment, "This matters more than your breakfast." Here's your quirky tidbit. One preserved scroll from the 11th century contains doodles. Yes, actual doodles of a donkey in green ink next to an unfavorable tax reassessment. Was it mockery, a clerical mistake, or the first known case of Byzantine desk boredom? No one really knows, but the artist did have decent line work. As you watch another clerk shake his cramped fingers and switch pens again, read now, you start to realize this whole ink color obsession wasn't just aesthetic. It was the operating system of the empire. Each color was a filter, a flag, a flashing neon sign in a world without email. A missed color could mean a missed payment, a delayed shipment, or worse, offending someone's rank. And in Byzantine society, offending rank was like walking into a lion cage wearing steak-flavored cologne. You pause at a desk where a young scribe is carefully switching inks mid-scroll using a palette stone divided into tiny grooves. The pen he's using has been cut at an angle so sharp it could probably slice garlic. He's humming something tuneless. His supervisor gives him a look. Humming is strictly discouraged. It vibrates the parchment. In this world, ink isn't just a medium. It's a message. Scrolls like these don't survive the centuries easily. Most were repurposed, rubbed clean, or simply devoured by time. But the few that do remain curled and faded in museum cases still bear traces of Byzantium's bureaucratic rainbow. And while you may not read Greek, the colors whisper their meanings if you listen closely enough. Red means watch this. Green means change that. Blue means stop right now. And somewhere in a dim corner of the archive, a forgotten scroll still waits to be read. Its ink, a fading code. Only a few sleepy-eyed historians still remember how to crack. You squint at a scroll held up to the candlelight, half expecting it to glow with some ancient magic. But no, it's just stained brittle parchment, crusted with a shade that once claimed to be the noblest of all purple. or, more accurately, something almost purple, depending on the day, the humidity, and the budget. You're in the Royal Archives now, and this section is about one of the strangest obsessions in Byzantine record-keeping imperial purple ink. Spoiler, it wasn't very purple. And it definitely wasn't very stable. Let's set the scene. You're a junior court notary in Constantinople, 9th century. Your robe itches your ink is drying too fast, and the guy in the corner keeps coughing ominously. But what matters most today is this. The decree you're transcribing is destined for imperial eyes. That means one thing: purple ink. Not just any purple either. Tyrian purple. The kind made from thousands of fermented sea snails. Yes, really. The fabled purple ink of Byzantium was derived from Murex brandaris, a Mediterranean mollusk with all the charm of a toenail and the fragrance of old fish guts. To create a single ounce of this dye, laborers crushed tens of thousands of snails and left their glands to steep in vats for days, sometimes weeks, until they produced a pigment so potent that it reportedly didn't fade for centuries. But here's the twist. It wasn't consistently purple. Depending on oxidation and how long it fermented, it could dry bluish-reddish, or even an odd brown-green. So why did it matter? Because in Byzantium, purple wasn't just a color, it was an identity. Born in the purple wasn't poetic fluff. It referred to children of reigning emperors literally born in a porphyry-tiled chamber deep in the palace. Purple ink then became a visual sign of imperial legitimacy. A single stroke from a purple-dipped pen could carry the weight of the throne or expose a forgery. Historians still argue whether Tyrian purple ink was used exclusively for emperors or shared sparingly with high-ranking clergy. Some believe bishops were permitted a diluted variant for certain liturgical documents. Others claim that even the church had to bow to the pigment monopoly of the throne. Either way, mixing up your inks back then wasn't a cute stationary accident. It could end your career or your breathing. There's one delightful footnote to this inky drama. Recipes for purple ink had a mind of their own. Some scribes lacking access to snail goo substituted more humble ingredients: iron gall mixed with madder root, or indigo steeped in wine. These improvisations gave the illusion of purple, and sometimes fooled the lower courts. But woe to the poor fool who tried that trick in front of the emperor. One monk allegedly faked imperial purple by mixing plum juice with soot, and tried to pass it off in a forged decree. His punishment: public shaming and a permanent ban from holding a quill, which in monk terms is like losing your voice. You run your finger gently over the faded lines of one of these imperial letters, marveling that something this soft and flowing was once guarded with almost religious intensity. The lines shimmer faintly if you tilt your head just right, and you wonder what poor scribes spent hours straining snail dye by candlelight, all for this single page. Of course, the scarcity made it more than just prestigious. It also made it unbelievably expensive. A single gram of Tyrian purple dye was worth its weight in silver. This, of course, led to ink rationing. Bureaucrats developed shorthand systems, tiny colored dots, in margins, code words embedded in text, to avoid wasting too much of the precious stuff. If the emperor only needed to sign his name, that was all he got ink for. No flowery closings, no unnecessary curls. Just enough pigment to scrawl basileus, and maybe a flourish if the empire was having a good tax year. Naturally, a black market sprang up. Dyers from the provinces tried smuggling mollusk extract into the capital, sometimes blending it with inferior dyes like woad or beet juice to stretch supply. The results: mottled manuscripts that looked like a bruise on parchment. And yet, some survived. One particularly infamous document in the treasury reads like it was written in melted plums. Historians think it was a forged property title involving 3 goats a vineyard and someone's unfortunate cousin. What's more curious is that some emperors actually started tweaking the purple tradition. Emperor Leo VI, ever the micromanager, apparently preferred his ink more reddish than purple. Later, Emperor Basil II dabbled in gold over purple inscriptions, a choice that required a second scribe just to trace over the dried ink in metallic leaf. Because obviously, what's imperial authority without a touch of glitter? And here's where things get surprisingly human. Many scribes, despite the rigid hierarchy and deadly seriousness of their job, left personal marks in their work, tiny drawings, margin jokes, or their names hidden in illuminated letters. A scribe named Stephanos once painted a miniature snail in the corner of a document written in purple with the caption, "For you, my slimy friend." That snail may be long gone, but his inky legacy lives on in archives that few people visit, and fewer still understand. As you close the page on this curious pigment, the candle flickers. The scent of old leather and ink dust rises around you. You can almost hear the scratch of a quill, the faint drip of a dye cauldron, the hushed sigh of a clerk realizing he's used the wrong color and is now morally and possibly legally doomed. Let's keep going. There's more color-coded drama waiting in the next scroll. You pinch your nose as the smell hits you, a heady blend of old vinegar-burned bones and something that might be rotting apricots. Welcome to the back workshop of a Byzantine ink maker tucked beneath a tile-roofed house not far from the city walls of Constantinople. It's humid, cramped, and buzzing faintly with the kind of flies that don't respect imperial titles. You're standing beside a half-blind artisan in a stained robe, watching him stir a pot with a carved stick that may or may not have once belonged to a monk. The Byzantines weren't just bureaucratic. They were meticulous, even when it came to the goopy mess of ink. And this was no ordinary black ink. No, you're helping prepare one of the empire's more prized concoctions, atramentum, the standard script ink made from soot and gum arabic. It sounds simple, but nothing in this empire ever is. First, someone burns olive pits or pine resin to create the right kind of soot. Then it's carefully scraped from chimney walls, mixed with water, sometimes vinegar, and thickened with sap from exotic trees shipped in on creaky boats from Egypt. Sometimes the soot was replaced with crushed charcoal, sometimes with lamp black, and sometimes when quality dipped a sad blend of mashed up berries and ashes from last week's decree fire. Historians still argue whether these substitutions were born from necessity or laziness. But one thing's clear, the final product had to glide smoothly over parchment without smudging or fading. Unless, of course, you were writing something you wanted to disappear. In that case, a little lemon juice and sunlight did wonders. Now let's move into the luxury range colored inks. Red ink made from cinnabar, or red lead marked headings, keywords, or imperial commands. But it was temperamental. If your ink maker messed up the proportions, it flaked. If the parchment was too dry, it cracked. And if the humidity was wrong, it ran like mascara in a medieval soap opera. One poor archivist in the 11th century wrote that red ink bled like a cut throat, which frankly feels a bit dramatic but relatable. And then there was purple ink, the holy grail of Byzantine stationery. Not violet, not plum, but the deep, slightly metallic hue of bruised grapes lit by candlelight. And no, it wasn't made from beets or berries. It came from murex, a sea snail harvested along the Phoenician coast. Imagine boiling hundreds of these spiny mollusks, some still twitching in vats over open flames, until they exude a pungent yellowish secretion. Then wait. Let it oxidize. Watch it turn green, then blue, and finally a vivid purple that stank of tide pools and glory. Congratulations! You've just created imperial purple illegal for use by anyone not on the Emperor's Christmas card list. It's important to note, the expense of creating these inks wasn't just about materials. It was about access. The guilds controlled recipes, tightly passing them down like family secrets. Some scribes traveled miles to visit a specific dye master in Cappadocia whose blue ink supposedly shimmered faintly under candlelight. Some whispered that alchemists could alter ink colors through prayer or planetary alignments. Others just added wine and hoped for the best. By the 10th century, Byzantine ink recipes read like occult scrolls. Take soot from a newly extinguished lamp mix with honey thickened over the breath of a fasting boy. And yes, that's a real instruction. Whether the fasting boy mattered is unclear, but you try finding one that didn't charge extra. Now, a curious footnote: metallic inks. Gold and silver ink, usually reserved for holy texts and emperor-commissioned documents, were notoriously difficult to apply. You couldn't just grind gold coins and call it a day. Instead, the gold leaf had to be painstakingly suspended in gum solution and brushed on with squirrel hairbrushes, which made you feel fancy and underpaid all at once. One fringe document even describes a glow-in-the-dark ink that used crushed fireflies mixed with resin. Whether it worked is unknown, though the margin note reads, "Use only on days of Saturn." Classic Byzantium. At this point, you notice your hands are covered in sticky soot. You try to wipe them on your tunic, but the artisan slaps your wrist and hands you a cloth that smells like sour olives. That's the thing about ink making. It's messy, sometimes smelly, and somehow still sacred. As you walk away from the workshop, dusk falling over the city's domes and turrets, you realize something strange. This ink, the thing clinging to your skin, staining your fingernails, it isn't just a tool. It's identity. It's law. It's gossip. It's scripture. And most of all, it's control. The colors aren't decoration. They're power. And power, as Byzantium knew all too well, stains permanently. So there you are, tucked into a high-backed wooden chair in a back chamber of the great palace in Constantinople. Your fingers still smudged with soot and vinegar from a failed ink batch earlier in the week. You've earned this promotion, they said. Assistant Document Examiner, Color Class Toit 2. What they didn't say was that your first task would involve reviewing 36 property tax appeals from goat herders, using exactly 0 shades of blue. Because here's the thing, in the Byzantine Empire, not all inks were created equal. And more importantly, not everyone was allowed to use them. In fact, some colors, most notably the coveted imperial blue and purple inks, were outright forbidden for commoners, scribes, and even mid-level officials like yourself. The penalties. Let's just say they went well beyond a slap on the wrist. Historians still argue whether the harshest punishments were written into law or simply strongly implied by imperial precedent. Either way, no one wanted to find out, and yet people tried. People always try. The law was clear. Purple ink was for the emperor and those writing on his behalf. Full stop. Blue ink reserved for documents either issued or directly approved by the imperial chancery. Gold ink. Basically a red flag. Unless you were in the uppermost echelons of the court or the church, you'd better not be caught even sketching a fish with it. Still, some scribes couldn't resist the temptation. You picture one junior clerk, let's call him Leontios, who thought it'd be clever to touch up the heading of his draft petition with a faint violet wash. Just a touch, just enough to make it feel official. He was last seen being reassigned to the outer garrisons of Armenia. For health reasons, allegedly. The real headache, though, came from the ink merchants themselves. Constantinople was flooded with imported dyes, some labeled deceptively, some pure counterfeit. You'd think a barrel marked monastic red number 2 would be safe. Nope. Turns out, under certain lighting, it shimmered bluish. One shipment caused a minor diplomatic incident when a provincial governor mistook it for imperial-grade ink and signed a letter to the Bulgars in what he thought was harmless burgundy. Even within monasteries, the rules weren't always clear. Technically, monks weren't bound by civil ink laws, at least not when writing scripture or theological commentary. But use purple in the wrong context, say on a grocery inventory for lentils. Suddenly, you're summoned to the abbot's quarters for a long, silent talk about humility and color palettes. You glance over your shoulder at the dusty law scroll pinned to the wall, a dry list of restricted substances and forbidden hues. Some of the language borders on the poetic. Let no man assume the shade of kings, lest he invite divine correction. That one always sends a little shiver down your spine, even if it was probably written by someone who spent a bit too long breathing ink fumes. Still, you wonder, was the obsession with ink color purely about power, or was there something deeper at play? After all colors had meanings. Purple signified divine authority. Red conveyed urgency or sacrifice. Black was the realm of ordinary record-keeping death by 1,000 quills. Ink wasn't just pigment. It was language, hierarchy, theology, a silent battlefield of tones and strokes. There were stories, too, fringe stories, whispered among scribes, like the tale of a village teacher who discovered a local flower that produced a blue tint near identical to the emperor's ink. He used it once innocently to decorate a wedding registry. 3 weeks later, he was visited by 2 silent men in fur-lined cloaks who confiscated every scroll in his home. The flower, ironically, was never seen again. And then there's you, sitting there, biting the tip of your pen reed, trying to decide if the ink batch you've been assigned leans a little too close to ultramarine. Better safe than reassigned. Even your supervisor, a sallow man named Basilios, with a voice like a rusted hinge, walks with visible tension through the ink racks. Stick to black or brown if you must, he mutters as he passes, not looking up. And for the love of St. Procopius, no shimmer. You stifle a laugh, but only barely. It's all so absurd, and yet also strangely beautiful. The Byzantine obsession with ink colors wasn't just bureaucratic pettiness. It was a culture trying desperately to define who was allowed to speak and how loudly. Color was rank. Color was ritual. Color was the ghost of the emperor himself on every page. So you dip your pen again. Not too deep, not too bold. Just enough to say, I was here. I followed the rules, and I lived to write another scroll. You sit at a long cedar wood table lacquered to a mirror finish by generations of bored scribes rubbing their sleeves across its surface. It smells faintly of lavender oil and somehow dried sweat. Around you, courtiers in layered silk garments shuffle parchment and murmur in Greek that's far too formal to understand. Welcome to a typical high-level council meeting of the Byzantine Empire, where ink colors are absurdly more decisive than the volume of a man's voice. The emperor sits elevated behind a thin curtain. He's visible, but only just. That veil, slightly translucent and embroidered with gold-threaded seraphim, reminds you that he's mortal, but not quite like you. You reach for your own stylus, waiting for your moment to mark the meeting minutes. But there's a problem. You've only been handed brown ink. And that's where things get interesting. See, in the Byzantine court, ink color is more than a preference. It's an unspoken rank system, a visual language that sorts the empire's hierarchy more rigidly than any organogram ever could. Black ink, boring, safe standard. Brown, you're a glorified secretary. Red, that's a whole different tier, usually reserved for heads of bureaus or archbishops making corrections. And blue is sacred. Blue ink comes from the emperor himself. No exceptions. In this hushed council chamber, color says what people dare not. A memo scrawled in blue needn't be signed. A note in purple. Yes, there's a purple, though the pigment changes from violet to muddy wine. Depending on the batch, implies personal review by the imperial family. Red marginalia could hint at urgency or dissent. And what you're seeing now, spread like a peacock fan across the table, is a masterpiece of bureaucratic color coding. Scrolls with golden titles and indulgence made possible by crushed chrysocolla and powdered glass indicate high ceremonial decrees. Next to them, neat black lines show legislative edits. But the ones that draw the eye. The tiny blue notations like whispers in the parchment, curling in delicate calligraphy, only a few scribes are trusted to write. Historians still argue whether these meetings were genuinely productive or just elaborate rituals meant to reaffirm the emperor's omnipresence. One theory suggests the actual decisions happened beforehand, backstairs in shadowy alcoves, and the public meetings were just performance inked in gold and sealed with pomp. But there's no denying how meticulous the process was. Every speaker, every scroll, every signature pre-assigned ink. If your ink was upgraded without permission, you could be accused of impersonating authority. That's not a slap on the wrist kind of crime. It's more of a vanish quietly into a monastic cell forever situation. You glance across the table. One courtier is furiously blotting a document with his sleeve. His hand trembles slightly, and you realize he's just noticed he signed with dark teal instead of black. It's a shade that might be confused with an early imperial blue under candlelight. Poor guy. You try not to stare. Now comes the reading of proclamations. As you listen, you can't help but admire how smoothly these color distinctions replace emotional expression. Where modern speakers might raise their voice or pound the table, here the message is, observe the crimson heading. This is serious. The ink speaks where the tongue remains polite. Sometimes, though, color is used to signal disdain. One undersecretary recently began sending all correspondence in sepia ink, technically legal, but associated with outdated tax ledgers. It's the Byzantine version of replying in Comic Sans. Just last year, the Emperor Justinian's chief advisor issued a memo in alternating green and red lines. Ostensibly, it was to highlight alternating points, but everyone in the know realized it was a not-so-subtle dig at his rival's obsession with rubrication. Passive-aggressive formatting Byzantine style, and still, it's all tracked. The palace maintained official ink registries. Each type, shade, and date of production was recorded much like we might log classified document access. If someone used blue ink, and there was no entry for its withdrawal from the archives, alarms, polite questions were raised. It's paperwork with its own paperwork. You wonder if the ink ever dries fast enough. But here's the thing, Byzantines had a trick for that too. They'd gently warm their documents over open oil lamps to dry them evenly, though occasionally This went wrong and led to a series of small but embarrassing fires. One archivist supposedly scorched half of a royal genealogy trying to dry a newly inked decree. His punishment, reassigned to poultry census duties in a Thracian backwater. Harsh, yes, but the geese probably appreciated the extra attention. Color also affects storage. Blue inked scrolls go into special cedarwood boxes lined with fabric. Why? Because moths and ink molds tend to spare silk-lined compartments. Brown ink dumped in a dusty shelf. Nobody guards brown ink. You slowly exhale. You've been writing in black this whole time. Safe, solid, emotionless. You're unlikely to make history, but you're also unlikely to mysteriously vanish on your way home. A breeze flutters through the open lattice behind you. It carries a faint whiff of beeswax and cold bronze. The meeting wraps up, and courtiers begin rolling their scrolls, sealing them with wax tinted to match the ink within. Blue seal, blue ink. Red seal, red ink. Bureaucracy as performance art. You tuck your own scroll into a plain canvas pouch. No colors here, just the steady weight of words nobody will read twice. But maybe, just maybe, someone will notice that you underlined one line twice. In black, the quietest act of rebellion. You're standing in a long, echoing corridor lined with polished marble and oil lamps. The smell of beeswax, parchment, and ambition clings to the air. Ahead of you, past a few yawning guards and an increasingly nervous eunuch, is the chamber where it all happened. A room not for war, not for worship, but for writing. And yet this quiet little chamber saw the unraveling of more than one dynasty. Tonight, you witness the ridiculous yet strangely real moment in Byzantine history when a dispute over ink color, yes, ink color, set off a palace coup. It starts with two men, one a eunuch named Constantine, whose title is too long to bother pronouncing, and another Nikitas, a mid-ranking logothete who managed imperial documents. They sat opposite each other at a long cedarwood table where the candles were trimmed just so, and their quills rested like loaded weapons beside stacks of freshly scraped parchment. You can almost hear the scratching start already. The issue Constantine had begun using a newly fashionable shade of cerulean gray ink for border notations. That's it, just the margins. But Nikita's an old-school stickler and deep believer in the proper tones of divinity, saw it as nothing less than a threat to imperial protocol. This grayish-blue ink to him was an affront to centuries of tradition. How could a mid-level bureaucrat use a hue so close to blue when everyone knew blue ink was sacred, reserved only for the emperor's hand or for the chrysobul, the golden decree? So like any reasonable adult, Nikitas accused Constantine of treason. And this is where things escalate in that particular Byzantine way. Whispered reports reached the emperor. Some claimed Constantine's ink was enchanted. Others said he was forging imperial orders. One account even suggested the ink was made from crushed beetles, stolen from a Persian envoy, which frankly just sounds impressive. Constantine, of course, denied it all, claiming his ink was merely an economical innovation for visibility in low lighting. That logic went nowhere. What followed was an emergency review by the Senate, or at least the few senators not napping through their honorary duties. And here's where the weird gets weirder. The Senate ordered a color trial. Seriously. They summoned scribes from the palace's ink testing department, yes, that existed, to verify if the gray hue strayed too close to the blue, forbidden for all but imperial command. The ink samples were laid out under sunlight, candlelight, and even in water, as if trying to see whether it would reveal some hidden sigil or magical threat. Historians still argue whether this elaborate pageant was just political theater or a sincere effort to uphold the chromatic law of the land. Meanwhile, the whispers didn't stop. Nikitas rallied a handful of conservative officials, stirring fears that Constantine was grooming a faction of color radicals inside the bureaucracy. Panic brewed, secret meetings, coded messages, an ink spill on an imperial memo mysteriously interpreted as a death threat. It all came to a head one spring morning when the emperor, mildly ill with indigestion from bad fish stew, was presented with two identical memos, one written in standard black ink, the other in Constantine's slightly bluish gray. He read both. He paused. Then, according to an account written later by a monk with a flair for drama, he dropped the blue-tinged version and asked, "Who dares bring heaven's tone to mortal hands?" Within a week, Constantine was arrested. And here's the twist: his arrest triggered a counter-reaction. A group of clerks and minor nobles loyal to Constantine believed the move was a veiled power grab by Nikitas. They stormed a meeting of the Bureau of Documents with ink bottles in hand, apparently as weapons, and locked the door from the inside. What followed was a 3-day standoff, now known as the Color Quarrel. No swords were drawn, but there were definitely a few sharpened pens. Ink bottles were hurled like grenades. The floor of the scriptorium ran purple, red, and black, with splattered dye. One unlucky intern reportedly slipped on a blot of walnut ink and dislocated his shoulder, possibly history's most bureaucratic injury. Eventually, the emperor sent his guards in with a calming decree. A neutral committee would be formed to regulate acceptable ink shades for each administrative tier. Constantine was banished, not executed, mind you, just sent to a monastery, where he supposedly kept developing new hues for hymnals. As for Nikitas, he mysteriously retired a year later after someone swapped his personal ink stash with fish sauce. No one claimed responsibility. From then on, the palace issued an actual ink protocol chart, listing precise RGB values for official use. Okay, not RGB exactly, but formulas involving soot levels, vinegar content, and whether or not dried mulberries had been involved. It all sounds ridiculous, right? But color wasn't just aesthetics in Byzantium. It was power. It was hierarchy. It was divine permission expressed on a goatskin scroll. And sometimes, just sometimes, it was enough to shake an empire. You're hunched in a dim stone alcove, candles flickering low behind you. The air smells like old parchment, warmed beeswax, and a little bit of moss. Your fingers are stained with iron gall ink, the kind that smudges just when you think it's dry. You're not a court official today. You're a monk, a tired one, and your quill is poised above a margin dangerously close to treason, or maybe just petty sass. See, in the quieter corners of the Byzantine world, far from the marble halls and court intrigues, monasteries were humming with their own kind of mischief. Rows of scribes copying religious texts by hand, hour after hour, month after month. The chanting never stops. The bells ring with unforgiving precision. You've just rewritten the life of St. Basil for the 7th time. And while the margins are technically for annotations or illuminations, well, no one said you couldn't be creative. That's where the ink colors come in. Officially, you've got black for the body text, maybe red for emphasis or scripture references. But if you're clever and discreet, you've tucked away a little vial of green or gold or burnt orange, mixed from your own garden pigments and slightly against the monastery's rules. And so next to a very solemn paragraph about sin and humility, you inscribe in shimmering crimson, "Brother Leon snored again today, louder than the bells of Hagia Sophia." Just a little note to yourself, and maybe the next monk who inherits the manuscript. Historians still argue whether this margin commentary counted as formal expression or mere scribal graffiti. Some think it was tolerated as long as it didn't interfere with the sacred content. Others suggest it was a subtle form of resistance monks using ink the way modern office workers might use sticky notes with sarcastic quotes. These margin notes, known now as marginalia, ranged from doodles of animals in silly hats to full-blown passive-aggressive commentary on abbots, bishops, and fellow scribes. And while many were written in standard black, the cleverest and pettiest were written in colored inks, a kind of whisper on the page. One famous example features a monk in the 10th century who, after copying 20 pages of theological treatise, scribbled in gold leaf, "Lord, forgive me." This author is very fond of repeating himself. It's not that different from a podcast review, really. In another, a monk used red ink to annotate a list of forbidden indulgences with "So, no dancing, no meat, no singing after dark." But Father Gregory's private wine stash is still fine. That last part was later scratched out by another scribe in black ink, but the red still peeks through if you squint. Colored inks weren't just tools, they were commentary. Some monks even developed their own personal color codes. One might use blue to mark dreams, green for doubts, and purple for ideas that sounded wise at midnight, but questionable at sunrise. Think of it as early medieval tagging, except your tag could be punished by 40 lashes and isolation in the cellar. Of course, this wasn't just about pettiness. There's beauty in the boredom. These inks brought life to endless repetition. They added texture to monastic life, which was largely silent, static, and obedient. And in that silence, colored ink became a way of asserting, "I am here. I thought this. I saw this flaw. I cracked this joke while fasting on barley mush and praying 7 times a day." There's a manuscript tucked in a Florentine library where one monk rewrote the margins of the Psalms to describe the changing seasons outside his cell, snow again. He scrawled in indigo beside Psalm 147, "And no cheese today either." The ink runs slightly, as if done with trembling fingers. Was it cold? Was he tired? Was he just tired of copying King David? Not all monks were so restrained. One anonymous scribe in a Cypriot monastery used red ink to draw a tiny bishop being chased by geese. Another, less artistically inclined, but still full of feeling, simply wrote in blue, "I hate this book." It's these little color-coded sighs that remind you, even in an empire of incense and hierarchy, someone somewhere just wanted to be heard, or at least to make a passing monk chuckle. And sure, sometimes the colored ink meant something serious, an edit from a superior, a correction of heresy, a divine vision hastily recorded before it faded. But more often, it was the ancient version of a bored student doodling during a Zoom lecture. Same instinct, different millennium. Today, historians sift through these manuscripts like treasure hunters trying to decode the whispers. Some say they reveal an emotional archaeology of the medieval mind. Others are more skeptical, arguing that without context, most of these notes could be anything from inside jokes to actual divine revelations. The debate continues. But you're still here in your cold robe watching your candle sputter. Your hand aches, your eyes blur, but your ink flows green today for the first time in weeks. You glance around, then scribble in the margin beside a solemn hymn. If God is watching, he's probably bored too. You're out on the fringes now, far from the gold-leafed corridors of Constantinople, and deep into the dusty tents of a Byzantine military encampment. A place where the scent of boiled grain, sun-drenched leather, and slightly questionable hygiene clings to the air. Here, parchment doesn't just carry polite decrees or tax memos. It carries orders, life or death ones. And the color of ink, it means everything. You sit beside a grizzled quartermaster named Mavros. He has a missing tooth, a sun-creased brow, and a fondness for muttering to himself. He's surrounded by scrolls tied in string, all stamped and marked in hues of red, black, and very occasionally blue. You watch as he unrolls one with shaky fingers, squints, and then immediately mutters something that sounds suspiciously like, "We're not getting lentils this month." Why? Because the ink is red. In the Byzantine army, red ink meant a ration reduction. It wasn't supposed to be cruel. Red was the ink of emergency orders, fast, short, and clear. But over time, soldiers began to dread those scarlet streaks. Red meant the wagons were delayed. Red meant grain had spoiled, or camels had wandered off again, or some general decided that Thracian troops could survive on half portions for the week. Red meant you're about to get very creative with your dinner. Now contrast that with blue ink. Rare, elusive, royal. If you saw blue on a supply order, you stopped everything. You unrolled that parchment like it contained sacred relics, because blue meant this order came from someone high, really high. Maybe even from the Emperor's council. Blue meant full pay. Blue meant wine with your bread. Blue meant, if you were clever and discreet, there was a chance to skim just a little bit off the top without anyone questioning it too hard. Historians still argue whether Byzantine supply chains were genuinely centralized or just loosely strung together with bribes and bureaucracy. Either way, color played its part. Scribes were trained sometimes under actual threat of lashings to get the color right. Mix up the red and the black. Someone might end up without boots. Or worse, someone might get boots. And no arrows. There was even a semi-official color key that floated through the ranks. Not published, of course. This was the Byzantine Empire. Nothing that useful was ever published. It was memorized, passed along by grumpy scribes and smarter junior officers. Red ink emergency ration cuts. Green ink medical instructions. Black standard daily orders. Blue high command directives. Gold ink that was either a forgery or a very fancy funeral announcement. You help Mavros shuffle through his papers. One scroll penned hastily in greenish ink contains instructions on treating trench foot with garlic and prayer. Another done in brown ink so faint it's practically camouflage seems to reference missing donkeys. Mavros sighs. "We're a mighty empire," he says, "but we've got no onions and no donkeys. Just ink." There's a story passed between campfires about a junior officer who forged a blue-inked supply order. He got away with it for weeks, enjoying butter-dried figs, even spiced meat luxuries far above his rank. But someone noticed the hue was just a little off, a little too watery, not quite imperial enough. Turns out he'd made the ink from indigo-dyed wool scraps, wine, and spit. Ingenious. Also, treason. They say he ended up reassigned to the furthest watchtower along the Armenian frontier, where even the sheep looked disappointed to see you. And then there's the case of a clerk named Agapetos, a detail man, slightly hunched, usually silent, always accurate. He was known for his ink perfection, like a human Pantone chart with sandals. When asked how he always got the shades right, he'd tap the side of his head and say, "I dream in palettes." They eventually made him chief of ink verification. Yes, that was a real thing. In one particularly chaotic campaign, Agapetos was credited with averting a logistical disaster by noticing that a red-tinted black ink was signaling the wrong pay rate for a cavalry unit. If he hadn't caught it, the soldiers would have shown up underfed and underpaid just in time for a border skirmish. The fact that this all hinged on a shade difference roughly equivalent to charcoal versus burnt plum says a lot about how Byzantines ran things. And maybe the most charming part, even out here, grime under the fingernails, armor chafing, and enemy archers somewhere in the hills, there were always a few scribes who took pride in their calligraphy. You'd find scrolls with loops so elegant they practically danced. Some even signed their names in tiny gold flourishes at the corner of ration logs. Because if you're going to track lentils, why not do it with style? You finish helping Mavros sort the day's orders. He offers you something that looks like bread, but tastes like slightly damp cardboard. He chuckles and says, "Well, at least it's not written in red ink." You laugh mostly because chewing is no longer an option. A breeze picks up, rustling the scrolls as the sun lowers behind the tent flaps. Somewhere, a bugle sounds not an elegant one, more like a goat sneezing through a pipe. And you realize in this corner of the empire, ink isn't just for writing. It's for surviving. You find yourself now in a cramped office just off one of Constantinople's many winding corridors, its air thick with lamp smoke dust and the soft rustle of parchment. The bureaucrat in question, a man named Dositheus, not a name destined for fame, leans over his scrolls with the precision of a man who knows the exact placement of every inkpot stylus and sealing stamp on his desk. He's not high-ranking, he's not noble, but what he does with colored ink, it's nothing short of legendary. Dositheus didn't start out trying to become a saint. He started like most mid-level functionaries of the Byzantine Empire by surviving. He copied tax declarations, re-inked border orders, filed complaints about stolen goats, and occasionally had to spell the name Theophylact 6 different ways on a single form. His true genius emerged the day he quietly asked, "What if we added gold?" Now, gold ink was not entirely unheard of. It was generally reserved for gospel books' imperial correspondence and that one weird bishop who insisted on using it for grocery lists. But Dositheus, he took it somewhere else entirely. He began adding microscopic shimmering borders to otherwise boring civil decrees. Not too much, just enough. Imagine getting an audit notice and thinking, "Wow, this sparkles." Historians still argue whether he was trying to flatter his superiors or just really liked shiny things. Either way, his scrolls began to stand out, literally gleaming from the piles of smudged soot-black scribbles his colleagues churned out. The quirkiest part, his penmanship didn't change. His formatting still pretty sloppy. But the ink, the ink. He concocted his own blend of powdered gold leaf fish glue and something he never disclosed, possibly fig sap, but that's hotly debated. The mixture took forever to dry and attracted ants. And yet, people began to request his scrolls specifically. One noble supposedly said, "If it's not by Dositheus, don't even send it to me." Now you might expect he was promoted. He wasn't. Promotions in Byzantine administration required either divine intervention or blackmail. But his name traveled. Monasteries began copying his styles. A small cult of scribes in Cappadocia adopted his method for sacred texts. There's even a fresco still intact that shows a man labeled the Illuminator adding gold to a page while an angel hovers above. It's probably not him, but it might as well be. One scroll in particular stands out. It was a peace treaty between two minor governors, a document that would have been lost to time had it not been radiant. Literally radiant. Scholars rediscovered it centuries later, stacked between dull tax reports, because a ray of sunlight caught the golden margins. And at the bottom, in tiny letters barely visible to the naked eye, was a flourished Dositheus, humble scribe servant of peace. Historians still argue whether this flourish was standard flair or a quiet form of rebellion. You can almost hear him thinking, they won't remember my face, but maybe just maybe they'll remember my ink. He never wrote anything grand, never led a reform, never took bribes, which may be his rarest achievement. But toward the end of his life, someone submitted a request to include his name in the liturgical calendar, not for his bureaucracy, but for the way he brought beauty into an otherwise soul-sucking job. And somehow in the tangled Byzantine machine, the request got approved. So today, in some dusty monastery corner, there's a niche icon showing a balding man holding a scroll with golden script. He looks tired, slightly cross-eyed, but peaceful. Around him swirl letters in shimmering ink, forming the haloed words, Saint Dositheus the Calligrapher. No one knows for sure if he's the same Dositheus. Frankly, there were dozens. But wouldn't it be just like the Byzantine Empire to canonize the wrong one and still have it feel exactly right? Either way, you can imagine him now hunched over his desk, gold-flecked ink, drying slow as molasses, candlelight dancing across the margins like tiny imperial stars. He's not trying to impress anyone. He's just making things a little nicer. And honestly, in an empire ruled by paranoia, intrigue, and deeply impractical robes, that might be the bravest thing of all. You're slipping through the corridors now, quiet, secretive the marble floors of Constantinople, whispering underfoot as you tail a figure draped in an ordinary wool cloak. He doesn't look like much, but that's the point. He doesn't want to look like much. That man is a spy, and in the folds of his tunic sewn into the lining, or maybe hidden inside a hollowed-out scroll rod, is something more valuable than a chest of gold coins, silk, raw, shining silk thread, and even more dangerously, the secret of how to dye it. You wouldn't guess it from the quiet pacing of the court records, or the hushed tones of sleepy monastery scribes, but the Byzantine obsession with ink colors was far more than bureaucratic nitpicking. It was espionage. It was economic warfare. It was imperial survival stitched with silk and soaked in dye. Back in the 6th century, when the empire was still dancing on the edge of greatness, silk wasn't just expensive. It was addictive. It shimmered like nothing else whispered against the skin. And most crucially, it took dyes like a dream, the most coveted of all purple. You remember Purple, our friend from earlier, who was definitely not just any old grape shade. The Byzantines weren't content just buying silk from middlemen anymore. No, they wanted the whole production recipe. And so Emperor Justinian, who rarely passed up an opportunity to meddle magnificently, launched one of the most daring espionage missions of the ancient world. He didn't send soldiers. He sent monks. 2 Nestorian monks, to be exact. Historians still argue whether they were already living in Central Asia or were sent out cold from Constantinople. But either way, these monks set out on what must have felt like a very long, very quiet suicide mission, bring silkworms back from China, the empire that guarded its silk secrets like holy relics. Now, imagine them trudging through deserts and mountains, praying under their breath not to be caught with contraband larvae in hollowed bamboo sticks. These weren't just any worms. These were the makers of silk, and their fate would soon twine with that of Byzantine ink. Because silk and ink are lovers, you see, especially when you're dealing with color-fast dyes, that only make sense if your fabric isn't unraveling in the sun. And the moment the Byzantines figured out how to raise silkworms and dye the thread properly, a quiet revolution began. Suddenly, Constantinople could compete with the Chinese. It could say no to Persian intermediaries. And more importantly, it could reserve the finest silks for imperial use, robes, banners, and of course, inked manuscripts. Yes, because guess what? Those golden threaded robes and temple curtains inspired ink tones. Once silk could shimmer in Byzantine dye houses, scribes wanted parchment to shimmer too. Recipes for gold-based inks, purple gum solutions, and rare mineral dyes circulated like gossip. What had once been the secret of fabric makers became the obsession of clerks and monks. And the colors, they came with rules. Only the emperor could use the brightest Tyrian purples. High-ranking court members might be granted a diluted version, maybe mixed with a bit of walnut or gall. Everyone else, stick with your soot and vinegar, thank you very much. You could be tried for impersonating a noble by using too lovely a shade in your signature. That's right, Byzantine ink could literally incriminate you. And as the silk industry grew within Byzantine walls, so did its cousin, the dye trade. Suddenly, markets bustled with sellers hawking saffron-based yellows, lapis blues and reds made from crushed insects shipped in from far-off lands. Not everyone used them for ink, of course. But the bureaucracy, oh, they noticed. A law from the 10th century buried in a collection most clerks barely glanced at, unless someone died or disputed their cousin's goat, specifically forbids non-court scribes from using any ink of foreign nature or iridescent hue. In other words, no shiny ink unless you had imperial permission. Because, to a suspicious court, shimmer could mean smuggling. And smuggling was everywhere. You imagine crates of olive oil being opened to reveal tiny pouches of illegal blue. You picture innkeepers discreetly selling saffron laced with ground minerals to traveling scribes. And every now and then, someone would get caught with stained fingers, literally, and hauled in front of a magistrate. The funniest part, most of the busted ink smugglers weren't even working for enemy empires. They were just bureaucrats trying to make their ledger entries sparkle. Maybe they thought if the emperor ever looked over their reports, the shimmer might earn them a compliment, or a raise, or at least a nod. And what of the spies? The ones who risked everything to bring back silk and dye knowledge? Their names are mostly forgotten. You don't get parades for worm smuggling. But in the palace records after their mission, something quietly shifts. The procurement ledgers stop listing imported silk. They start listing state-produced silk. A couple of years later, new entries appear for violet ink imperial reserve. So the next time you picture a sleepy scribe hunched over his parchment, remember he's part of a centuries-long espionage chain. His colors were fought for, smuggled, cultivated in secret. And whether he was writing a law code, a prayer, or a quiet complaint about how cold the scriptorium was, every drop of that ink is a legacy of silk spies and scrolls with soul. You're leaning against a cold marble pillar in the outer chamber of the great palace, and from where you stand you have a clear view of something most people never saw. What boredom does to men in robes with too much stationery, and not enough wars to fight. The year is 1045. The emperor is late. Again. And while diplomats from far-off kingdoms shuffle and yawn in their embroidered boots, one eunuch at the side table is quietly changing history. Using ink, His name, no one remembers. And that's half the beauty of it. He wasn't a general. He wasn't a bishop. He wasn't even that high up in the civil chain, just a mid-tier functionary with sharp calligraphy, a sharper wit, and access to the treaty documents of the empire. The thing is, he was also a little bit of a prankster, which in the Byzantine court was like playing dice with the gods while holding a leaky inkwell. So there's this big deal being hashed out between two trading blocs, the Byzantines and the merchant guilds of Amalfi. It's meant to settle maritime tolls, trade routes, and a few insults hurled across the Adriatic. After weeks of dull, chest-puffing negotiations, a beautifully scripted treaty is finally prepared. But the clerk, your buddy with the wry smirk and too many spare hours, decides to make a small edit before it goes out, using a near-identical shade of blue ink, slightly more silvery if you tilt the parchment, just so he changes one clause. Instead of all imports shall be taxed equally, it now reads, all imports shall be taxed exceptionally. That's right. One word. One quiet swipe of a brush. Now historians still argue whether he meant it as a joke, a protest, or a passive-aggressive way to get out of working late. But what they do agree on is this: 2 weeks later, the treaty falls apart. Amalfi claims betrayal. Byzantium accuses them of incompetence. A minor diplomatic spat escalates into 3 years of tense standoffs, port inspections, and a truly ridiculous amount of gold ink wasted on rebuttals. And the clerk, he vanished. Or maybe he was promoted sideways. Or maybe he quietly penned his confession into a corner of the imperial archives and let time take care of the rest. You can picture it now, can't you? A sealed document box in a forgotten scriptorium, its hinge squeaking softly as the wind slips through the rafters. Inside the original draft, 2 versions side by side. One inked with official pomp, the other bearing the faint shimmer of rebellion like moonlight on spilled wine. There's something oddly soothing about the chaos ink can cause when it's this subtle. No marching armies, no boiling oil, just a flourish of pigment, a slightly too confident calligrapher, and a paper trail no one was meant to follow. You walk now through another part of the palace, a corridor with tapestries fluttering just enough to catch your eye. Somewhere nearby, a copyist whispers curses at a broken stylus, while another hums as he stirs his ink, unaware that the shade he's using has just been quietly banned. Because here's the thing. After the stationery sabotage, the court passed new regulations. Ink hues were restricted again. Secretaries were required to double-check pigment with appointed shade inspectors. Yes, that was a real title. They even had badges. Of course, those badges were also color-coded. A few court artists responded by inventing diplomatic gray, an ink that shifted depending on the angle, always technically within the rules, yet never quite readable. The emperor banned it immediately. Naturally, demand doubled. There's an almost juvenile joy to how the Byzantine court played this game of color cat and mouse. Every time they tightened ink laws, someone found a way to break them not by shouting, but by writing a little softer, a little smarter, as if each brush stroke whispered, "Catch me if you can." You pause beside a writing desk carved from dark walnut, covered in abandoned ink pots. One bears a label in Armenian. Another smells faintly of myrrh. The last is sealed with wax and stamped "Do Not Use." It's cracked anyway. See, despite the rules were meant to be smudged. The deeper you dig into the archives, the more you find tiny anomalies. Letters ending with blotches, in odd hues, scrolls, whose margins shimmer under candlelight treaties, with corrected phrases that weren't corrected at all. They're the paper ghosts of petty revenge, boredom, and low-grade political sabotage. And they're delightful. Just imagine being a diplomat from Venice, fresh off the boat, holding a signed document, only to realize the decorative filigree includes a joke at your city's expense. In Latin, in red ink. No war was declared, but you can bet someone's wine budget got slashed for it. Byzantium may have been famous for its grandeur, but it survived on paper. It ran on color. And when those colors misbehaved, whether on purpose or by accident, they carried far more weight than any sword or scepter. So next time you look at a boring office memo, think about the guy who nearly triggered a diplomatic meltdown with one extra adjective. And maybe, just maybe, he's your spirit animal. You're seated now at a cramped wooden desk, the kind that wobbles ever so slightly when you lean on it. The air in the room is musty, but not unpleasant. Parchment and beeswax candles give it a sleepy warmth. In front of you, a dozen half-finished scrolls are scattered across the surface. You dip your brush into a shallow dish of rust-colored ink pause and wonder for just a moment if this ink has a soul. To a modern eye, ink is just liquid color. But to the Byzantines, those gloriously obsessive bureaucrats of the Eastern Roman Empire, it was something closer to divine, especially colored ink. Especially if you were using it to write scripture, spell out the will of an emperor, or detail a calendar of saints, so complicated that even the saints would get confused. You drag your brush across the page. The ink pools differently depending on its ingredients. And different ingredients, well, they meant different spiritual weights. Red wasn't just for visibility. It evoked blood sacrifice and authority. Gold wasn't just decoration. It stood in for celestial light. And blue was something else entirely. Deep divine, often reserved for God the Virgin Mary and the Emperor. Preferably not in that order. Monks, theologians, and imperial scribes spent hours arguing, not loudly, mind you, over which color was appropriate for which line of which letter in which psalm. Historians still argue whether the color coding of sacred texts was based more on theology or simply which dyes happened to be available that week. Spoiler, it was probably both. The idea of ink possessing a kind of soul and animating essence wasn't metaphorical to them. Many scribes wrote prayers before grinding pigment, asking that their ink not betray the truth. Others stored unused colors in separate sanctified vessels. Imagine separating your highlighters like they were holy relics. You sigh. You've been working on a single sentence of John's Gospel for what feels like half your life. And every letter must be outlined in red, filled with dark indigo, and edged with just the faintest flicker of gold. Why? Because the bishop said so. And the bishop says he dreamt it. Of course, color symbolism wasn't exclusive to Christian texts. Medical treatises written in the capital often used green or brown for illnesses, red for cures, and black for, you guessed it, death. You can almost hear the exasperated sigh of a medieval doctor leafing through a miscolored manual and wondering if he was supposed to bleed the patient or bury them. In more mystical traditions, especially among fringe religious communities in Cappadocia, and the Sinai colors of ink were thought to carry specific energies. One surviving prayer scroll uses 7 inks in one line each for a different archangel. One of them is made from saffron, another from crushed lapis, and a third, beet juice. It's always beet juice. Some monks even claimed that if you copied a sacred text in impure ink, mixed on a day when you were angry, for instance, it could void the entire spiritual efficacy of the book. That's right. You could copy the entire Psalter perfectly and still doom someone's soul because you were grumpy when you stirred the pot. It wasn't just superstition. It was aesthetic discipline, a belief that form and function must serve the soul together. And in a world where few people could read the color of the ink, often mattered more than the words themselves. You could see red and know this means glory. You could see blue and know this means authority. You could see gold and feel awe, even if the sentence just said, "Turn the page." Even commoners who never held a scroll in their lives knew to bow if they glimpsed a streak of purple ink in procession. That wasn't just pigment. That was imperial essence on parchment. The inks themselves were frequently blessed, especially those used for church records, land deeds, or marriage registries. Yes, even your Byzantine prenup might have been sanctified. The scribe might have murmured a blessing as he scrawled your name in emerald green ink, hoping your union would last longer than the empire's tax code. And it wasn't only about religion. The symbolic soul of the ink spilled into poetry letters, even love notes. "I write you in blue because my heart is heavy with longing," goes one fragment found in a decaying cellar in Thessaloniki. The fragment ends with a gold-flaked signature which may have been sincere, or a very medieval flex. Toward the end of the empire, as resources dwindled and dyes grew scarce, ink colors became simpler. Less pageantry, more practicality. But some scribes still insisted on coloring their final lines in fading purple, or grinding up a petal or two just to give the illusion of reverence. Even as their world shrank, they clung to the dignity of hue. You can almost see it now, one lonely monk with frost-bitten fingers alone in a crumbling monastery, copying out the Book of Job in shades of red and gray. His ink freezing in the cup, his letters trembling. But still, he believes the colors matter. That maybe they help the words carry a little further into eternity. And maybe he's right. You sit quietly now. The clatter of court shoes, the rasp of quills, the murmurs of royal edicts, those are all behind you. You're in a small, slightly musty room. The scent of aged parchment and dried flowers lingers in the air, curling around the last curls of candle smoke. This is no bustling scriptorium or palace archive. This is a personal workshop, someone's final sanctuary. And in it sits a man who no longer rushes to match the emperor's tempo. The scribe, his hands gnarled from decades of ink and labor, dips a brush into the last vial of blue ink he owns. It's not the royal sapphire blue, the kind forbidden to mere mortals during the empire's height. No, this is a paler, watery echo of it. But still, there's reverence in how he holds it. You notice the way his hand hovers just for a second above the parchment, like he's unsure whether to finish the last line or let the sentence remain unfinished, suspended in history. Outside, the empire has shrunk. Provinces have fallen. Borders have shifted. Even the idea of Byzantium seems to flicker at the edges of memory, like gold leaf rubbed too thin. But in here, the colors remain. He still arranges his pigments by the old codes. Red for royal decrees, green for agricultural accounts, black for everyday requests, blue for something close to grief. The scribe doesn't write imperial orders anymore. These days he copies prayers, letters, maybe a memory or two. His ink palette has faded, but you realize that color still holds meaning for him. He doesn't speak it, but the blue strokes he draws into the margins. They're not decorative. They're laments. Blue is mourning, quiet dignity, hope pressed flat. Historians still argue whether blue ink truly lost its forbidden status after the fall of Constantinople, or if its power simply became symbolic. But you can see what it means now through his hands. a steady line, a trembling curve, a single teardrop-shaped smudge. It said that toward the very end, some scribes whispered that their ink had souls, that each drop recorded not just words, but weight. The sadness of knowing you're the last to write in a dying tradition. The stillness of an empire exhaling its final breath through a script no longer read by emperors. The man smiles softly as he finishes his line. He doesn't look up. He doesn't need to. The room is full of memory and the ink is enough. The candle sputters. The parchment cools. And you sit beside him for a moment longer, just watching the blue dry. The flame is low now, and so is your breath. The ink has settled into the parchment like footsteps in old snow, gentle, permanent, unhurried. You let your shoulders drop. The room around you softens. Sounds blur. Time stretches. You've wandered through candlelit halls and dusty archives tonight, through curious margins and vanished laws, through the tender absurdity of assigning meaning to colors. And yet, wasn't it all strangely peaceful? Every page, every pigment, every bureaucratic blunder quietly, human, gently, odd, a little poetic. Even the scribe's final strokes echo like lullabies now. It's okay to let them fade. Not everything needs to be remembered in full. Some stories are meant to be slept through. Some history only exists to hush you into stillness. So go ahead, let go of the scrolls, the rules, the colors. Sink deeper into your blanket, into the mattress, into quiet. Breathe slower. No emperors, no ink codes, just rest.